Ward back with Robert P. Murphy, and we're discussing the mortgage mess, and we're also going to discuss his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. Dr. Murphy, like I told you, I haven't had a chance to get completely through your book, but do you address these sorts of issues in The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism?
Well, I don't think I addressed the current crisis because at the time I was writing it, it hadn't really manifested itself yet. I do talk about the insidious role of the Federal Reserve and why the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are not good for the consumer, but this particular mess hadn't yet really come to fruition yet.
Well, that sort of dovetails with what I was talking about before the break, the fact that Ron Paul's been criticizing Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae for years and years. And to what extent do you think that central planning, such as is encompassed in those kinds of agency, contributed to this problem?
Well, I think it definitely contributed. We can argue about how much of this whole crisis was due to any particular factor, but clearly the government, through those agencies and then also through certain anti-discrimination statutes and other just policies of that nature, has encouraged mortgage lenders to give loans to people that really shouldn't have been getting those loans in the first place, or they shouldn't have been getting such large loans for the houses they were trying to buy. And so the government-sponsored enterprises of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they, in a sense, were spreading the risk around. So they would go into the secondary market and buy mortgages, bundle them together, and then sell them off. And even though there's not a strict legal guarantee that the federal government's going to back them up, a lot of investors thought that if those things ever really did start tanking, the government would step in to rescue them. And it looks like that expectation was correct. I mean, a lot of what the government's doing so far, it's coming just short of using taxpayer money to bail out these bad investments.
Well, this sounds like Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, because, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the savings and loans crisis, and the fact that a good part of the reason for that was the FDIC insuring deposits and those people doing things that with other people's funds that wouldn't have been done if they didn't have this so-called government safety net. Are we facing the same sort of behavior?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, if you just think about it in terms of the incentives, and again, if you want to understand, why were all these being, because if you take the standard story that these people with billions of dollars at their disposal were just buying assets and they didn't even care about the creditworthiness and they were just very naive and misled by the rating agencies, and some of that's all true, but it's just fascinating. Why would they be so sloppy with billions of their own money? And now we see part of the answer is that they thought, okay, if we are wrong and things really do turn out catastrophically, we'll probably get bailed out by the government. So if you're right, you win, and if you lose, the taxpayer bails you out. And so why wouldn't you take risks in that environment?
Well, it seems like a lot of hubris, too, because the CEO of Countrywide, which is one of those that's the mortgage companies that you see most at risk, and I don't remember his name, but he basically touted Countrywide's practice of trying to bring people into homeownership that under the old standards of work hard, save, have a good credit rating would never have qualified for loans. And he was out there publicly touting that now at the expense, I guess, of his shareholders.
Right. You do see that, and you're right. There is a certain amount of hubris involved that because it's not just all the same people, that there's different competing groups, and in a certain environment, certain groups are going to profit. So during, let's say, from 2002 to 2006, the lenders that were using these arms and all these newfangled techniques of buying assets and bundling them together and then selling the product off, what's called financial engineering, these people were all making money hand over fist, whereas the more conservative, old-school investors were sitting on the sidelines and just saying, well, I don't really think you guys are doing something smart there. But people, if they have short-term horizons and they're seeing that this group over here is making 18% returns, 20% returns, and these other people aren't, a lot of money flows into that. So you did see in the last few years people rise to the top of these investment banks and other places who practice these unsavory techniques, and now they're being flooded out of the system. And that's the thing. If the government just stayed out of it and said, okay, you guys made big bets and you lost, and now you have to eat your losses, the market would learn a lesson, and so we wouldn't be as prone to this next time. So that's why the government's bailouts and all these other devices where they're just printing up new money and just doing all sorts of auction schemes to try to correct or try to stop the correction from happening, is just going to tell these big banks that it's okay to take huge gambles because you don't have to really eat your losses if they go sour.
Well, that gets us into a topic that I wanted to talk to you. You talked about the auction techniques. For the first time today, I heard of this new so-called tool that the Fed is trying to use called the term auction facility. What is that?
Well, what's happening is typically when the Fed wants to loosen the money supply, wants to ease the credit situation, they engage in what's called an open market operation, and they buy securities from banks in exchange for increasing their reserves. And then there's also the Fed itself can just lend out reserves to people. But there was a certain stigma if a bank went to the Fed to borrow money. That was sort of a signal to the other banks that, that bank must be in dire straits, and that's why it has to go to the Fed rather than going to its other member banks. And so with this auction approach, the Fed, instead of saying, we will give out any amount of money at this stated discount rate, instead the Fed says, okay, we've got a certain amount of money that we're going to auction off under a bidding process, and then, the high bidder gets it or whatever the rules are. And the point of this was to try to take the stigma away. So it was sort of like trying to make it okay to get welfare checks in terms of big banks. And so that's why they've been emphasizing that, is they try to want to just change the rules so this is no longer appears as banks in trouble going to the government for money. Well,
another theory I've heard about this is that one reason, you talk about that they don't want to be perceived as getting welfare checks. Could this have something to do with the FASB accounting rules where they don't want to have to change their books in order to really account for all the true losses that are out there? Am I even using the correct terms of art here?
I think you are using the correct terms. I'm not an expert on the precise accounting rules, but you're right. Another aspect of what's going on here is the government is normally when the government wants to get more liquidity into the market, it takes short-term treasury notes like debt that the government issues from the banks in exchange for additional reserves with the Fed. Now what's happened, it started back in September, and now it's been happening more and more. And this is, if your listeners remember, the announcement on Tuesday that led to a rally in the markets. It was a $200 billion announcement. What the Fed is doing is it's giving its own treasury debt, so its own obligations on the federal government, which are very safe investments because Uncle Sam's not likely to default anytime soon. And it's swapping them with banks for short-term loans, and then it's taking these mortgage-backed securities from the banks as collateral. So the Fed is basically telling these banks, we will value, in terms of the collateral that we're assigning to it, these very risky loans that no one in the marketplace wants to touch. And so it's allowing the banks, you're right, to continue this illusion that the banks don't want to just declare to their investors, okay, we lost $300 billion on these mortgage-backed securities. They can sort of maintain a fantasy land where on their books they value them at a certain price, because right now nobody's buying these things, and so it's not clear how much on your books should you say they're worth because the markets for them have collapsed. Well, and so you're right. So the issue is this is allowing the banks to continue this fantasy because the Fed's valuing them at this artificial price.
Well, and talking about fantasies, this is supposed to be for 28 days. Do you really think it's only going to be for 28 days that they have this swap between the Feds and the banks?
Well, right. No, like I say, it's been going on since September. So they're short-term loans, but yeah, they keep rolling it over. And so no, it's strictly speaking, it's a 28-day loan on each individual transaction, but no, the problem's not going to be solved in 28 days, and so the government's going to have to either continue doing it or it's going to have to do something else.
Well, I was telling you during the break that I saw a headline today in the Telegraph, the British online paper, Fed takes boldest action since the Depression to rescue U.S. mortgage industry, and that's what they're talking about, this accepting of $200 billion worth of bad housing debt into by the federal government. What sort of consequences will that have for you and me, the regular taxpayers who have managed our affairs with some sense?
Right. Well, what no one's really talking about here is what happens when these mortgage-backed securities don't perform, when people start defaulting? So I think a lot of analysts are just looking at it as, well, yes, a little bit different and a break from precedent, and I think that's why that headline referred to it being, the boldest move since the Great Depression, that they're accepting these mortgage-backed securities, because as I say, that's unusual for the Fed to be so specific about the specific asset class and saying, yes, we will honor that as collateral in exchange for us giving you government debt. But what happens if those things just completely default? So the Fed has swapped and given $1 billion in T-notes, let's say, and then getting $1 billion in mortgage-backed securities, but really those things are only worth $200 million because so many mortgage payers are going to default. So what happens to that $800 million difference? Is the Fed going to eat that, or which ultimately means the taxpayer, or are they going to say to the banks, you have to cough up the difference? Well, and I think the way things are going, that the government's going to eat it, and that ultimately the tax, but we're going to be responsible for the difference there between what those mortgage-backed securities are really worth and what they're worth on paper that the Fed is counting them as collateral.
Well, I think you know who Michael Rosoff is. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. He writes over at Lew Rockwell, and he was writing about this, and he basically believes this is akin to partial nationalization of the banks because, by giving this $200 billion to the bank, the federal government has become a part owner of the banks. I mean, this is starting to sound like a banana republic. Do you agree with him?
Well, yes, I do agree with him, and I'm really amazed that not more people have noted that. I mean, look, if the federal government just came out and literally said, we are going to come in with $200 billion and buy up these mortgage-backed securities and just hold them ourselves and use tax money to buy it, everybody would go crazy and say, wow, you guys are just explicitly bailing out these mortgage lenders. But what they're doing now, it's just so confusing. I mean, you and I are taking 10 minutes to try to decipher exactly what's even happening here with the Fed doing this swap and so forth. But, yeah, I mean, the government is basically doing just short of what I just said. And in essence, the government is nationalizing part of the ownership of these mortgage-backed securities. Well,
is this a stimulus to the economy for them to do this?
Well, no. I mean, that's the thing that's ironic. What I mentioned before we had the last break is that forget all of these negative consequences that you and I have been talking about. Even on the face of it, none of these measures is going to solve the alleged problem. That the reason right now the credit markets are seizing up is that the various companies, they don't know how to trust the books of the other companies, so no one wants to make a loan to another bank because they're afraid that bank might go belly up because they can't trust when the other bank lists what its assets are in its balance sheet. If there's mortgage-backed securities on that, they don't know how to value that, the counterparty. And so by the government, by doing these operations, they're just allowing the banks to continue this fiction of saying their assets are worth such and such. And so it's just going to continue this where none of the banks trust each other, and they're going to have to keep going to the government for their funding.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that is kind of scary to me is a couple of months ago we thought that Abu Dhabi was going to come in and save Citicorp, and then I read that they're not. So I guess they're wising up about the bad debt. We're coming up on another hard break, and we'll be back to talk to Dr. Robert P. Murphy about these very scary and important matters after the break.